In the twilight years of the Weimar Republic, Germany stood adrift, its soul fractured by humiliation, fear, and the ghosts of a lost war. Out of this broken landscape emerged a new order, an order promising discipline, destiny, and revenge. At its center stood a man who demanded more than loyalty. He demanded worship. Around him formed a black uniformed circle of guardians, men who swore not merely to protect, but to embody his will. What began as a modest protection detail for political rallies soon transformed into something far more sinister. Under Heinrich Himmler, a bureaucrat with the gaze of a zealot, the SS shed its role as mere bodyguard and took on the shape of an ideological brotherhood. Himmler envisioned his men as the future aristocracy of a racially purified empire. They were to be the model Germans, physically perfect, spiritually unyielding, and utterly devoted to the Führer. Each new recruit entered a world stripped of doubt and empathy, where every lesson, every oath, and every symbol reinforced one message: obedience was salvation. Their training was not confined to the rifle range or the parade ground. It reached deep into the mind. Recruits studied racial science, learned the mythology of Germanic bloodlines, and absorbed tales of ancestral warriors who had conquered and cleansed. Indoctrination classes painted the world in black and white, Aryan and alien, pure and polluted. They were told that compassion was weakness and mercy, a form of betrayal. The SS creed became a kind of secular gospel, its verses built from pseudoscience and superstition. In those early years, the uniform itself carried power. Jet black cloth, silver runes, the skull insignia, all designed to project fear and devotion in equal measure. The Totenkopf, a stylized death's head, reminded its wearer that life was temporary but the Reich eternal. Polishing the boots, folding the collar, adjusting the cap, all small affirmations of belonging to something greater than the self. By the late 1930s, the SS had evolved from a paramilitary curiosity into a state within the state, commanding police forces, intelligence branches, and the growing network of concentration camps. Those chosen to join were not merely soldiers but instruments. Their acceptance required proof of racial purity stretching back generations. Family trees were traced, birth certificates examined, ancestral villages visited. A single Jewish grandparent or Slavic bloodline could disqualify a candidate. Himmler wanted warriors of flawless heritage, living proof of his delusion that the German race could be engineered like a weapon. Behind the rituals and genealogical paperwork lay a vision of control so complete it touched not just the body, but the blood itself. The first glimpses of what this new brotherhood would become appeared in Austria and Czechoslovakia. During the Anschluss in 1938, SS detachments marched not as conquerors, but as redeemers, their presence framed as the return of lost sons to the German motherland. Civilians lined the streets, cheering, unaware that beneath the polished boots and banners lay a system already rehearsing the mechanics of domination. In occupied Prague, the SS displayed the efficiency that would later define its terror lists, prepared in advance, arrests executed with mathematical precision, disappearances recorded in ledgers rather than screams. The Wehrmacht, Germany's traditional army, watched uneasily as this political force grew in power and privilege. To its officers, the SS seemed more like a cult than a corps, a place where ideology trumped experience. Yet Hitler favored them precisely for that reason. He saw in Himmler's men a mirror of his own obsessions: purity, obedience, destiny. When the war began, he would rely on them not merely to fight, but to believe without question. The men rose before dawn, their days filled with drills, lectures, and rituals. Meals were taken in silence, broken only by hymns to the Führer and the Reich. Punishment for doubt was humiliation. Punishment for dissent was exile or death. To question orders was to betray the bloodline. They were told that mercy toward the enemy was treason to their ancestors. Each lesson stripped away another layer of moral restraint until only the uniform and the ideology remained. He compared his organization to a medieval order of knights, bound by faith rather than law. In speeches delivered to closed halls, he spoke of a future where SS families would populate the conquered East, their children raised as guardians of a new civilization. He described extermination not as murder but as cleansing, conquest not as cruelty but as duty. In his logic, to kill for the Reich was not an act of violence but of service. Those listening seldom questioned. The language of righteousness dulled the edges of horror. By the time German troops rolled into Poland in 1939, the SS had already internalized its purpose. Villages were cleared, suspects executed, undesirables transported. To the outside observer, it looked like military efficiency. To those inside, it felt like fulfillment of prophecy. For the first time, the SS operated as both army and ideology, carrying rifles in one hand and dogma in the other. The world began to take notice. Reports filtered back to London, Paris, and Washington describing atrocities committed by black uniformed men who seemed immune to fear and devoid of remorse. Even among Germans, whispers grew. Wehrmacht officers, stationed alongside SS divisions, found themselves disturbed by their allies' fervour. They act. One general wrote privately, as if possessed by something beyond human comprehension. Within the Reich itself, such possession was celebrated. Propaganda films portrayed SS men as noble, stoic figures who smiled in the face of death. Posters adorned street corners, showing blonde warriors standing beneath banners of lightning bolts. The message was clear. The SS did not merely serve Germany. They were Germany. And for those living under the regime, the illusion was powerful. Those same sons, once enlisted, were taught to see themselves as chosen instruments of fate. By the outbreak of global war, the transformation was complete. What had begun as a bodyguard unit now stood as the ideological spine of Hitler's empire. They marched with a sense of sacred purpose, convinced that the world outside their creed was diseased and doomed. Behind them followed the machinery of terror that would soon consume Europe. The SS had become not just an organization, but a belief system, one that worshipped purity, demanded obedience, and promised immortality through destruction. The seeds of their fate were already sown. For when a man believes he is chosen by destiny, he ceases to see others as human. And when that blindness spreads from one man to an entire army, the line between protection and extermination dissolves completely. The SS began their journey as guardians of a leader. They would end it as executioners of a nation's conscience. As Europe edged toward chaos, the SS stood ready to transform belief into bloodshed. The invasion of Poland marked not only the start of war, but the birth of a new kind of soldier, one bound less by duty and more by ideology. Every village burned, every civilian deported, every order followed without hesitation reinforced the idea that these men existed beyond morality. The SS would no longer remain a mere extension of Hitler's security apparatus. It would become a full-fledged fighting force. Late in 1939, permission was granted to create the Waffen-ss, the armed wing of the organization. It began modestly, with only 4 divisions, but its growth was relentless. Within a few years, the number would swell to over 500,000 men. They were trained not only to fight, but to believe, to merge the rifle and the rune into a single identity. Their indoctrination was as vital as their weaponry. Political education sessions filled the hours between drills, where instructors recited lessons on racial destiny and the sacred duty of conquest. The mind became a battlefield long before the soldier reached the front. Fear, pity, and doubt were labelled as defects to be purged. Those who hesitated during training were not merely reprimanded, they were re-educated. The SS handbook described hesitation as a disease of the spirit. To many inside the regular German army, these men seemed alien. They were soldiers, yes, but also zealots. Wehrmacht officers, steeped in old Prussian codes of discipline, viewed them with suspicion. Yet within Hitler's inner circle, their devotion was celebrated. The Führer admired their ability to act without question, to transform ideology into motion. In their obedience, he saw purity. The waffen-ss became both military elite and political weapon. Unlike the Wehrmacht, its divisions swore an oath not to the nation, but to Hitler personally. It was a subtle shift that reshaped the meaning of loyalty. To disobey the Führer was not insubordination, it was heresy. The SS fought not for Germany, but for the myth of Germany, an imagined empire cleansed of imperfection. Each victory, no matter how small, was framed as a spiritual triumph, each defeat a test of faith. Material superiority accompanied ideological privilege. The Waffen-SS received some of the best equipment available. Sleek MG-42 machine guns, newly designed Panther and Tiger tanks, superior rations, and tailored uniforms. Their gear gleamed under the European sun, a reflection of their status within the Reich. In propaganda reels, they were depicted as fearless modern knights, embodiments of Aryan strength. Behind those images, however, lay a darker truth. Their elite status was purchased with the spoils of brutality. In occupied territories, SS divisions acted with autonomy, rarely seen in traditional armies. Orders flowed downward, but accountability dissolved. Operations against partisans in Poland, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union blurred the line between combat and extermination. Villages suspected of harboring resistance were wiped from the map. Populations relocated or slaughtered under the justification of security operations. Reports from the Eastern Front described entire districts emptied within days. Fields littered with the remnants of both homes and lives. To the men who carried out these acts, it was not murder, it was maintenance of order. They saw themselves as the steel wall, holding back the chaos of inferior races and Bolshevism. The enemy was no longer a soldier across the field, but a concept, a contagion that had to be erased. This belief made them fight with a kind of calm desperation, as if each battle were a ritual cleansing. When surrounded, they fought on. When wounded, they refused capture. The line between courage and delusion vanished. Recruitment drives spread across the Reich, promising honor and belonging. Young men, many barely out of school, volunteered in droves. Propaganda posters showed smiling faces beneath black caps. Slogans whispering promises of greatness. For those who joined, the transition was swift. Civilian life was stripped away, replaced by ritual, discipline, and a sense of destiny. Letters sent home spoke of service to the eternal Reich, of standing guard over Europe's soul. Few mentioned fear. Even fewer mentioned guilt. The Waffen-SS also reached beyond Germany's borders. Volunteers from Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and even France enlisted. Drawn by propaganda that spoke of defending Western civilization from communism, entire battalions composed of foreign recruits emerged, men fighting not for conquest, but for ideologies. Seductive promise. To Himmler, this internationalization confirmed his vision, a pan-European order united by creed rather than nationality. Yet beneath the rhetoric of unity lay the same hierarchy: German officers above, foreign ranks below, all serving a machine built on purity and exclusion. Inside the Reich, the prestige of the SS soared. Civilians stepped aside as the black uniforms passed. Newspapers celebrated their victories with reverent tones. Mothers whispered prayers for sons serving under Himmler's banner, proud to be linked to the elite. Even as rumors of atrocities spread, most Germans dismissed them as enemy lies. The myth of the SS as a force of order and discipline persisted, carefully maintained by propaganda films and radio speeches. But within the upper echelons of the regime, competition brewed. Wehrmacht commanders resented the resources diverted to the SS. They saw their divisions receiving priority shipments of weapons, fuel, and food. At the front, soldiers joked bitterly that the SS fought with polished boots, while others starved in the mud. The rivalry deepened as the war dragged on, each side vying for Hitler's favor. They embodied his own fanaticism, unyielding, merciless, convinced of their divine mission. By the time the first winter campaigns began in the east, the Waffen-ss had gained a reputation for both effectiveness and savagery. They moved through the frozen landscape like instruments of annihilation, leaving behind scorched villages and mass graves. Reports from their own officers noted that morale improved after every act of violence, as if destruction itself sustained them. They believed the war would reshape the world, and that they were its chosen architects. Among Allied intelligence circles, the legend of the SS began to grow. Stories circulated of divisions that never surrendered, of men fighting until their last bullet. Prisoners described their captors as machines, unflinching and precise. Each account fed a growing fear that the SS were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but something colder, something that transcended human instinct. To face them was to confront an enemy who did not fight for survival, but for ideology. As the war spread westward and the battles grew bloodier, the divide between the SS and the rest of the German military widened. The Waffen-ss saw themselves as the vanguard of a new order, unburdened by conscience or compromise. To them, the ordinary army was obsolete, a relic of a softer age. When orders came to destroy entire towns suspected of harboring partisans, they obeyed without hesitation. When commanded to execute prisoners, they did so with precision. In their minds, mercy was not an option, it was contamination. By the end of 1942, the transformation envisioned by Himmler was nearly complete. The Waffen-ss had become the embodiment of total war, merging ideology, technology, and brutality into a single entity. They were admired by their superiors, feared by civilians, and despised by enemies. Within their ranks, the belief persisted that they were not fighting a war, but fulfilling destiny. That illusion would sustain them through years of slaughter and ultimately condemn them to infamy. By the midpoint of the war, the SS no longer needed to proclaim their power. It travelled ahead of them. Their reputation moved faster than their tanks. A dark wind that whispered through villages and across trenches. Even before their banners appeared on the horizon, fear had already done much of the work. Entire communities fled at the rumour of their approach, and soldiers who faced them spoke in half-believing tones of a force that fought beyond reason. The early campaigns in Poland and the West had already set the pattern. Columns of smoke marked the passage of SS units. Villages reduced to rubble under the justification of reprisal. Civilians suspected of aiding resistance were lined up against walls, their lives measured in seconds. The Totenkopf division, originally born from the guards of concentration camps, became synonymous with these actions. In France, during the retreat of 1940, unarmed prisoners of war were massacred on fields that only hours before had been battle lines. The event spread by rumour rather than report. For official records seldom survived where the SS operated. Each new atrocity strengthened a legend that the Allies could neither ignore nor comprehend. For the first time since the Great War, soldiers whispered that mercy had no place in modern combat. Letters home hinted at encounters too brutal to describe. Among Allied ranks, a simple patch of lightning runes was enough to twist courage into suspicion. They were not facing men, they told themselves, but symbols walking embodiments of the machinery that had built the camps and burned the cities. In the east, the scale of violence reached an abyss. SS divisions moved through the vast plains of the Soviet Union, tasked not only with battle but with extermination. Behind them followed the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that turned ravines into graves. While the regular army advanced, these detachments executed orders designed to erase entire populations. Jews, communists, and partisans were shot in mass pits, each bullet justified as part of the cleansing of Europe to the world beyond. The SS became the face of this cruelty, a uniform that signified both order and annihilation. Reports began filtering back to London and Washington through the channels of resistance networks. Partisan fighters spoke of black-clad troops who burned entire villages for a single act of defiance. Photographs smuggled across borders showed ditches filled with bodies. In intelligence briefings, Allied analysts debated whether these were isolated crimes or an organized policy. The conclusion came slowly and with horror. The SS were not rogue elements. They were the policy itself. Fear changed the rhythm of battle. Allied soldiers advancing through Western Europe after day treated encounters with SS units differently. The runes on a collar became a warning. A cornered Waffen-SS platoon was expected to fight to the death, and so the expectation of surrender faded. The enemy's fanaticism provoked its own reflection, a grim symmetry of violence that crept into both sides. Among the ranks of ordinary German soldiers, tension grew. The Wehrmacht, despite its own complicity in atrocities, still clung to the image of professionalism. To them, the SS represented a distortion, a force of zealots, unconstrained by convention or conscience. Soldiers whispered that serving beside them was dangerous, for where the SS marched, retribution followed. On the Eastern Front, when Soviet forces captured German prisoners, the question of whether a man wore SS insignia often decided his fate within moments. Propaganda amplified the myth. Inside Germany, films and newsreels glorified the SS as unbreakable warriors. They were depicted marching through ruined towns with calm precision, their faces expressionless beneath steel helmets. The message was one of invincibility, designed to reassure a weary populace that the Reich still had its chosen guardians. Yet outside Germany, those same images produced the opposite effect. To Allied audiences, they were not heroes, but executioners, cloaked in ceremony. The lightning bolts on their collars became shorthand for cruelty itself. In battle, this dual perception shaped every encounter. To the SS, reputation was a weapon as sharp as any blade. They believed that fear weakened the enemy before a shot was fired. To the Allies, it became a justification for vengeance. A captured SS soldier was rarely treated as a prisoner of war, but as an embodiment of collective guilt. Stories of faked surrenders spread across the front lines, accounts of men dropping their rifles only to fire concealed pistols moments later. Whether these incidents were frequent or not mattered little. Belief alone was enough to alter behavior. Suspicion replaced mercy. The idea that an SS man could never be trusted made every confrontation fatal. Within the Allied ranks, the shift was visible in small acts of silence. Officers turned their gaze when captured. SS men were marched behind barns. Reports of summary executions seldom travelled beyond the platoon level. The official command maintained adherence to the Geneva Conventions, but on the ground, the rules dissolved. The war had become too personal, the moral distance too small. Each fallen comrade made the next decision easier. The SS had taught the world that belief could justify anything, and the lesson echoed in reverse. Even in the final years of the conflict, when the Reich's collapse was imminent, their fanaticism did not fade. Encircled and outnumbered, SS units continued to fight as though surrender itself were sin. In Normandy, the Hitlerjugend division, composed largely of teenage recruits, fought until annihilation. In the Ardennes, during the winter of '44, the Malmedy massacre sealed their infamy when American prisoners were lined up and shot in a frozen field. The image of bodies sprawled in the snow spread through Allied ranks like a contagion. From that moment, many resolved that no SS man would ever be spared again. The myth of the unyielding warrior had come full circle. What was once a symbol of pride within the Reich became a mark of doom on the battlefield. Every act of resistance, every refusal to surrender, confirmed the enemy's worst fears. When SS soldiers were captured alive, they faced not interrogation but instinctive retribution. The cycle of violence fed on itself until mercy became a forgotten language. Beyond the front lines, civilians learned the same fear. In occupied towns, the mere rumour of an SS presence sent families into hiding. Farmers abandoned their fields at the sight of unfamiliar boots. Entire communities carried the memory of burned houses and vanished neighbours. The knowledge that a single accusation could summon destruction. To them, The SS were not soldiers, but storms, forces of nature without reason or restraint. By 1944, the once disciplined image of the waffen-ss had splintered. Some divisions remained formidable. Their tactics still feared. Others devolved into fragments of desperation. Yet the legend persisted, stronger than the men who carried it. Fear had become self-sustaining, a phantom marching even where the soldiers no longer stood. Allied war correspondents wrote that the SS were everywhere and nowhere, a phrase that captured both their mythic presence and their inevitable downfall. In the end, reputation itself became their greatest prison. Those captured could not escape the stories that surrounded them. Those still fighting could not live up to the myth they had created. The world had come to see them, not as humans, but as embodiments of evil, and in some terrible way, they had come to believe it themselves. The transformation that began with oaths and symbols had reached its final stage. Identity consumed by infamy. The fear they inspired would outlive them. In the ruins of cities and the silence of liberated camps. Long after the war ended, the memory of those uniforms, the black sheen, the silver skull, the lightning bolts, would stand as warnings carved into the collective mind of history. What began as devotion had become dread, and the world, once terrorized by their presence, would never again forget the shadow they cast. By the time the Allied armies stormed the beaches of Normandy, the black insignia of the SS carried a meaning far beyond the battlefield. It was no longer just a uniform. It was a confession. Visible before a word was spoken, those who wore it stepped into combat, knowing what awaited them if captured. The reputation of their divisions, built on years of atrocity and fanatic resistance, had hardened into an unwritten law. The SS would give no mercy, and they would receive none. The Western Front became a theatre where vengeance walked beside duty. News of massacres like Malmedy spread through the Allied ranks, not as official reports, but as stories whispered between soldiers cleaning their rifles. The image of American prisoners executed in the snow imprinted itself on every heart, transforming caution into fury. Many resolved silently that the next man wearing lightning runes would not be allowed to live long enough to raise his hands. Orders from high command still spoke of Geneva Conventions and humane treatment. Yet, on the frozen roads of Belgium and in the hedgerows of Normandy, war's logic had shifted. Within the Waffen-SS, surrender was regarded as spiritual failure. Recruits were taught that captivity was worse than death, that an SS man's duty was to fight until his last breath. Instructors warned that the enemy would torture and humiliate them, twisting fear into armor. When Allied soldiers advanced toward trapped SS units, they often found them firing until the last round. Grenades clutched even as tanks closed in. The effect was devastating, not only physically but psychologically. Facing an enemy unwilling to yield eroded the instinct for restraint. Among the Allied troops, stories circulated of false surrenders, accounts of men dropping their weapons only to pull concealed pistols or grenades, moments later passed through the ranks like poison. Whether many of these tales were true hardly mattered. Belief alone was enough to kill trust. Every gesture of surrender became suspect. Soldiers hesitated before accepting raised hands. Some stopped accepting them at all. A glance at the collar, a glimpse of the runes, and hesitation turned to gunfire. The bitterness was intensified by what the liberating armies began to witness. As they moved deeper into occupied Europe, camps appeared behind barbed wire and crumbling walls, each a silent record of the regime's devotion to death. At Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen, the Americans and British found bodies piled in heaps, skeletal survivors wandering between them like phantoms. Many of the guards had been SS men, some still wearing the same black insignia. When soldiers saw these scenes for the first time, something in them broke. The official rules of war could not survive the sight of thousands of corpses stacked like timber. In that moment, discipline gave way to vengeance disguised as justice. At Dachau, as the gates were forced open, gunfire echoed almost immediately. SS guards, rounded up and disarmed, were executed in the chaos. Some accounts spoke of American troops firing in rage after discovering boxcars filled with the dead. No written orders sanctioned these acts, yet few voices rose to condemn them. The boundaries of morality had dissolved in the heat of liberation. For many, revenge felt like a form of mourning. Even away from the camps, the pattern continued. On battlefields across France and the Low Countries, captured SS soldiers often vanished between the front lines and the prisoner pens. Field reports occasionally mentioned unaccounted casualties, a phrase that cloaked what everyone understood. Officers turned their gaze elsewhere. The war was too vast, the hatred too raw, and the SS too recognizable. Each execution became both secret and inevitable. Inside the SS ranks, the consequences of their own infamy were well known. Soldiers began scraping insignia from tunics, burning documents, or tearing the blood group tattoos from under their arms. Yet, these efforts rarely succeeded. Their faces, their bearing, the cold pride in their posture betrayed them. To the Allied eye, an SS man could not disguise the way he carried himself. The uniform might be gone, but the identity lingered like a scent. Among British troops, rumours of atrocities committed by SS divisions in occupied Europe fueled the same cycle. Stories of murdered commandos and massacred villagers hardened into conviction. One British officer later recalled that when his men captured SS prisoners, no one had to give orders. In such moments, the war's moral core had collapsed. The men who had once been told to fight evil found themselves confronting it within their own reflections. Canadian and Polish soldiers felt this same fury. The Canadians who faced the 12th SS Panzer Division in Normandy, composed largely of Hitler Youth, carried memories of comrades executed after surrender. Revenge became a quiet ritual, unspoken but understood. For the Poles, whose homeland had suffered under the SS for years, mercy was unthinkable. Their vengeance was not born of policy, but of memory. Cities burned, families vanished, graves without names. By late 1944, the distinction between battlefield and atrocity blurred beyond recognition. As Allied forces pushed through Germany's western borders, the fighting grew more savage. Civilians hung white flags from windows, yet SS units continued to resist, forcing entire towns into ruin. Villages that should have been taken in hours became days-long struggles. Each delay cost lives, and every life lost deepened the conviction that the men responsible were beyond redemption. Even within the German lines, the SS found themselves increasingly isolated. Regular army officers resented their arrogance and blamed them for the war's moral decay. As defeat loomed, the Wehrmacht began to fracture. In some regions, German soldiers surrendered en masse, but SS detachments held out, sometimes fighting against their own countrymen. There were reports of Wehrmacht troops turning their guns on SS units to hasten the war's end. An act that symbolized how completely they had become outsiders within their own nation. The Allied High Command officially demanded adherence to international law. Orders circulated, reminding troops that prisoners must be treated humanely. Yet these words, printed in distant offices, held little meaning on fields still warm with blood. Commanders in the field faced impossible choices how to restrain men who had seen the evidence of what the SS had done. Many simply looked away. Silence became the final permission. In this atmosphere, vengeance blurred into routine. What had begun as spontaneous rage hardened into an accepted pattern. To some, it seemed like balance restored. To others, it marked the final degradation of everything the war was meant to defend. The killing no longer belonged to ideology, but to exhaustion. After 6 years of relentless violence, no one expected purity of conscience. Yet amid the chaos, there were moments of dissonance. A handful of Allied soldiers, confronted with captured SS men, hesitated. Some saw the same fear in their enemies, eyes that they felt themselves. In that split second, the illusion of difference faltered. But these moments were rare, fleeting, as sparks in the wind. The war had become too vast, too stained, for compassion to endure. By the closing months of the conflict, the fate of the SS was sealed not by command, but by emotion. The very force that had built its identity on fear and brutality now faced that same energy reflected back upon it. They had made themselves unrecognizable as human, and the world responded in kind. Each field execution, each act of vengeance, became part of a larger reckoning, one that could not be contained by treaties or trials. When the fighting finally ended, few among the SS found sympathy or refuge. Many lay in unmarked graves, unnamed, their insignia buried with them. Others fled, stripped of rank and identity, their tattoos carved away in desperation. But the legacy of what they had created, the cycle of belief and retaliation, remained, echoing through every story told after the guns fell silent. In the end, the symbol they had once worn so proudly became a curse, and the creed that promised immortality delivered only infamy. In the vastness of the East, the conflict between the SS and the Red Army became something beyond war, an experiment in total destruction. The steppe itself seemed to absorb cruelty, its soil drinking blood without judgment. Between the black-clad divisions of the Reich and the ranks of Soviet soldiers stretched a moral wasteland where no code survived. On that front, pity was a liability and surrender a form of suicide. The seeds of this annihilation had been planted long before the first shots were fired. Nazi ideology framed the Soviet Union not as an enemy nation, but as a plague to be eradicated. The war was preached as a crusade against subhuman Bolsheviks, a collision between civilization and chaos. The SS were assigned not simply to fight, but to cleanse, to turn entire regions into proof of the Reich's racial fantasies. Orders from Berlin spoke of pacification, but in the field, the word meant burning villages, shooting prisoners, and reducing populations to ash. As the front lines rolled eastward in 1941, the waffen-ss followed behind the Wehrmacht like a shadow sharpened to a knife. In Belarus and Ukraine, their columns passed through landscapes already scarred by invasion. In some areas, resistance flared, and every act of defiance was answered 100-fold. The SS had been told that compassion endangered the mission, that mercy prolonged the infection. The logic of extermination took root so deeply that even the youngest recruits accepted it as common sense to the Soviet people. The black uniforms came to represent death itself. Families fled into forests, children hidden in haylofts, entire villages vanishing overnight. Partisans struck from the shadows, and retaliation fell like lightning, indiscriminate, immediate, complete. Whole communities were wiped out as examples, their ashes meant to speak louder than words. Those who survived learned that survival itself was an act of resistance. The SS did not distinguish between fighters and families. All were condemned by geography and ancestry. When the tide turned and the Red Army began its advance westward, vengeance gathered momentum. Soviet soldiers moving through liberated territory found evidence of what had been done. Pits filled with civilians, barns filled with bodies, the stench of deliberate cruelty. Reports of these discoveries reached frontline units, and the effect was irreversible. The Red Army was no longer fighting an enemy, it was exorcising a plague. The Commissar Order of earlier years, which had declared Soviet political officers outside the protections of war, returned in reverse. Captured SS men were treated not as prisoners, but as disease carriers. Many never reached the rear alive. The annihilation unfolded as mirror images, each side reflecting the others. Brutality until no moral distinction remained. Soviet soldiers rarely took the black insignia alive. Field interrogations were brief, often consisting of a single glance. In forests near Smolensk and the ruins of Minsk, SS prisoners were lined up against crumbling walls, their fate sealed by reputation alone. The executions were not formal. They were gestures of history balancing its scales. Even among the German command, there was an unspoken understanding that the East offered no return. Orders instructed SS divisions to fight to the last man rather than risk capture. The myth of martyrdom, dying for the Reich, was reinforced through speeches and letters. Entire units perished in encirclements, their positions overrun, their bodies frozen in defensive lines, long after the shooting stopped. For many, it was less a choice than an inevitability. The system had trained them to believe that surrender was dishonor, and dishonor worse than death. As Soviet troops advanced westward through the winter of '44, the horror multiplied. Villages, once occupied by SS units, became scenes of spontaneous retribution. Civilians who had survived the occupation turned on their tormentors with stones, knives, and farm tools. In Poland and the Baltic states, captured SS men were often dragged through the streets before being executed. No trials, no formalities, only the raw arithmetic of revenge. The Wehrmacht, increasingly desperate to distance itself from the SS, began to fracture. Commanders complained that the atrocities committed by Himmler's men provoked retaliation against all Germans. Yet the separation was impossible. The black uniform had become the symbol of the Reich soul, and the Wehrmacht's protests could not erase its complicity. Soldiers in grey were shot alongside those in black. The distinction mattered little to those who had suffered. Within Soviet ranks, hatred had been institutionalized. Propaganda posters urged soldiers to show no pity. Leaflets depicted the SS as beasts in human form, their deaths portrayed as acts of cleansing rather than cruelty. Political officers reminded troops of Leningrad's starvation, Stalingrad's ruins, and the villages left smouldering behind the retreating enemy. The enemy was not just military, it was metaphysical. To kill him was to purify the earth. Amid the destruction, some attempts at survival bordered on the grotesque. SS men fleeing westward tried to remove their blood group tattoos with razor blades or hot irons. Others swapped uniforms with fallen Wehrmacht soldiers, hoping to vanish into anonymity. Yet these gestures rarely worked. The smell of ideology clung to them, the posture, the silence, the way they refused to beg. For Soviet troops who stormed Berlin in 1945, the sight of SS insignia inspired an immediate response. In the chaos of the final assault, executions occurred within minutes of capture. Basements, alleyways, and cellars became impromptu tribunals. Some of the last SS defenders of the Reichstag were shot after the battle ended, their bodies left in the rubble as warnings. The victors did not distinguish between those who had commanded camps and those who had merely believed. The war's closing days were filled with such blurred retribution, half justice, half catharsis. Civilians joined the fury. In German towns overrun by the Soviets, locals who had suffered under the regime took vengeance of their own. Collaborators and party officials were dragged from hiding, their SS affiliations shouted by neighbours who remembered too well. In places where no military court could reach, mobs rendered their verdicts swiftly. The Reich that had promised order dissolved into chaos, its architects devoured by the very violence they had unleashed. By the time the last gunfire faded, the Eastern Front resembled a wound more than a victory. The soil itself seemed to hold memory, each village a scar, each field a grave. The SS, once heralded as the guardians of a new civilization, had become its executioners and its victims. Their annihilation was both physical and symbolic, a final reflection of the ideology that birthed them. In post-war testimonies, surviving Soviet officers spoke of those encounters without triumph. Many admitted that by the end, revenge had lost its flavor. The men they executed were ghosts. Before the trigger was pulled empty vessels of a dying faith. Yet even this acknowledgement could not soften the memory. For the millions who had lived through the occupation, the destruction of the SS was not cruelty, but necessity. It was the only language the war had left to speak. What had begun as a campaign of conquest ended as mutual damnation. The Eastern Front consumed both predator and prey, leaving behind landscapes where nothing seemed alive. When historians later traced the path of the waffen-ss across the Soviet Union, the maps resembled burn marks. Each line of advance marked by villages erased, rivers clogged with the remnants of bridges and bodies, forests that never grew back. In the end, the SS did not simply lose the war. They ensured that it could never be won. Their attempt to remake the world in purity had created only ruin. On the soil they sought to conquer, there would be no monuments to their cause, no memory of honor, only the silence of a continent that had seen too much. And in that silence, the black uniforms vanished, swallowed by the very darkness they had once served. As the Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, the empire, built on fear, turned inward upon itself. The sound of artillery replaced the speeches, and the myth of the invincible SS dissolved into smoke and rubble. In the cities, once draped with banners and hymns, silence fell heavy and confused. The men who had sworn oaths to die for the Führer now faced a different kind of reckoning. The slow and inescapable realization that death might be kinder than capture. Across Germany, the black uniforms began to disappear. Columns of retreating soldiers burned insignia, buried weapons, and stripped away their rank. In back alleys and forests, fires glowed through the night as men pressed red-hot metal against their own skin, trying to erase the small blood group tattoos that could betray them. Some wore the grey coats of the regular army, hoping to pass unnoticed. Others shaved their heads or smeared themselves with dirt, pretending to be displaced civilians. The empire of order had disintegrated into a wilderness of disguise. Civilians watched this transformation with mixed emotions. Many had once saluted these men in admiration. Now they turned away in disgust or fear. In small towns, whispers spread that SS officers were hiding among refugees, their papers forged, their medals buried beneath garden soil. Some were caught by locals who remembered the sound of their boots on cobblestone streets, the neighbours they had taken away. Justice came not from courts, but from rope and rage. Others managed to vanish, slipping into the chaos of surrender, their pasts dissolving among millions on the move. The Allied advance uncovered what the regime had tried to hide. The camps stood open, their gates unguarded, their secrets laid bare. Soldiers who entered them found scenes that defied comprehension. The stench of decay hung in the air, mingled with the faint sound of survivors too weak to speak. Liberators moved through the remnants of an industry designed for extinction. Piles of shoes, mountains of hair, rooms filled with the belongings of the vanished, all silent evidence of the system that the SS had built and managed with bureaucratic precision. These discoveries spread quickly through the ranks. Reports of what lay behind the wire circulated among troops, and the shock hardened into anger. For the men who had fought across Europe, the war's meaning shifted. Victory was no longer measured in captured ground, but in retribution. Field executions multiplied. Captured SS guards were dragged before the evidence of their crimes and shot where they stood. Officially, such acts violated orders. Unofficially, they were seen as cleansing the air, within days of Germany's surrender. The same pattern repeated itself across the ruins of the Reich. In Berlin, Soviet patrols combed through cellars and ruins, pulling out the remnants of SS units that had fought to the last bullet. Many were executed immediately. In Bavaria, American troops discovered officers who had tried to blend among prisoners, their tattoos betraying them. British and Canadian forces reported similar findings. Clusters of men claiming to be regular soldiers until their pasts surfaced under interrogation. The black insignia had become a death sentence, visible or not. Among the German population, vengeance was no longer the monopoly of foreign armies. Civilians who had lived under SS rule began their own reckoning. In some places, captured officers were paraded through the streets, their uniforms stripped, their medals torn away. Old women spat in their faces. Children threw stones, and men who had once cheered them now demanded atonement. The same society that had nourished them now sought to erase them, to pretend that the devotion had never existed. The post-war trials that followed the Nuremberg proceedings and countless smaller tribunals turned the SS from men into symbols. Witnesses spoke of trains that never returned, of mass graves that stretched beyond sight. Documents recorded everything with the precision of accountants, leaving no room for denial. The organization was declared criminal, its very name synonymous with evil. Yet for all the verdicts and hangings, many escaped. Some fled through secret networks that carried them south into the Alps, or west into sympathetic monasteries and safe houses. Others reached distant continents, trading new names for forgotten crimes. In the occupied zones, rumours spread of former SS men living quietly under assumed identities. Farmers, teachers, factory workers. Occasionally, one was recognised decades later, pulled from anonymity by an old photograph or a scar that never faded. The trials that followed these discoveries became ritual acts of remembrance. Each arrest reaffirmed what the world already knew. The shadows of that order had not vanished, but merely learned to walk in daylight. For those who survived openly, life after the war was a slow erosion. Many denied everything, claiming to have been conscripts or clerks, never killers. Some insisted that they had known nothing of the camps, that they had only followed orders. The line between ignorance and obedience blurred until it dissolved. In post-war Germany, silence became a form of survival. Families avoided the subject. Communities buried the past beneath reconstruction. Yet the memory lingered in the background, a quiet hum beneath the miracle of recovery. Historians later described the SS as a paradox, a modern organization built on medieval faith. Its members saw themselves as chosen guardians of civilization, yet their actions destroyed the very idea of civilization itself. In their quest for purity, they had rendered the world impure. The uniform that once symbolized perfection came to represent annihilation. The men who had believed themselves immortal became ghosts, haunting the century that followed. The myth they built did not die easily. Decades later, fragments of that ideology resurfaced. Symbols on banners, whispers in fringe movements, nostalgia disguised as patriotism. Each reappearance reminded the world how fragile memory could be, how easily the past could reassemble itself when left unguarded. Museums and memorials rose to counter this forgetting, their walls filled with the names of the murdered. Every plaque and photograph stood as a barrier against the return of belief. For the survivors, the prisoners, the civilians, the soldiers who had witnessed too much, the war never truly ended. They carried its weight in silence, unwilling or unable to describe what they had seen. Some testified in courtrooms decades later, their voices steady but distant, as if reciting from someone else's life. Others refused to speak at all. The crimes of the SS had been committed in broad daylight, yet the world still struggled to look directly at them. In the final reckoning, the SS achieved nothing of what it promised. The 1,000-year empire lasted barely more than a decade. Its architecture reduced to ruins and its ideals to ash. What remained were lessons carved in absence, the understanding that ideology, when worshipped as faith, consumes its believers before it devours the world. The SS had begun as guardians of a leader. They ended as symbols of humanity's capacity for self-destruction. In post-war photographs, one image repeats: an Allied soldier standing over a heap of discarded uniforms, the black cloth dulled by dust and rain. The runes are still visible, faint but unmistakable. They lie twisted and empty, like the skin of something that once believed itself immortal. The war's noise finally gone. The men who once wore those symbols are gone. Now some executed, some vanished, some living long enough to deny their own history. Yet the echo of their footsteps remains, not in triumph, but as a warning. Every ideology that demands purity, every faith that replaces thought with obedience, carries within it the same seed. The world that emerged from the ruins of 1945 understood this truth in its bones. The cost of forgetting is repetition, and so the SS passed into history. Their power dissolved, their name cursed, their legacy etched in the memory of millions. They had sought eternity through domination. Instead, they found it through infamy. The shadow they cast still lingers, not as honor, but as a mirror held up to the darkest corners of the human soul.